Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that every dollar you have is suddenly worth almost nothing. Banks are locking their doors. Your boss can't pay you. Your neighbor is selling his furniture on the sidewalk just to feed his family. Grocery stores have food, but you can't afford any of it. Entire cities are quiet, not because people are asleep, but because factories that once thundered with machines have gone completely silent. Now imagine that this isn't happening to a few scattered families, but to almost everybody in your country. And not just your country, but across oceans: America, Canada, Europe, Asia, Latin America. Millions of people facing the exact same nightmare at the exact same time. This wasn't a scene from fiction or a dystopian movie. This was real. This was the Great Depression, the most devastating global economic collapse in modern history. And by the end of this video, you'll understand what truly caused it, why it lasted so long, and the shocking stories, mistakes, secrets, and human tragedies that history books often leave out. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe, stay with me till the very end, and drop your thoughts or questions in the comments, because what you're about to learn will absolutely change the way you see money, governments, and the world economy forever. So, what was the Great Depression beyond the surface-level definition most people hear in school? Most people think they know it. The stock market crashed in 1929. Everyone got poor, and things got better later. But that's not even 5% of the truth. The Great Depression wasn't just a market crash, it was the collapse of an entire system built on illusions, risky decisions, and blind confidence. At its core, it was the moment when the global economic machine revealed how fragile it truly was. And to understand why it happened, we have to rewind to the 1920s, an era known as the Roaring Twenties. A decade so booming, so radiant, so full of new inventions, culture, and wealth that many people believed poverty itself was disappearing forever. New inventions like the automobile, radio, refrigerator, and assembly line factories were transforming the world. For the first time, millions of ordinary families had access to consumer goods that once only the wealthy could afford. People were buying stocks, cars, homes, and even the newest electronic appliances, all on credit. That word is extremely important. Credit. The 1920s economic miracle wasn't powered by cash, it was powered by debt. People borrowed money to invest in the stock market. Companies borrowed money to expand. Even banks borrowed money to lend more money. The entire economy rested on the assumption that everything would keep going up. But what happens when a booming train is going too fast? At some point, it derails. The US stock market became the beating heart of this illusion. By 1928, more than 1 million Americans were investing in stocks. Many of them had no understanding of finance whatsoever. They simply believed prices would rise forever. In fact, around 90% of all stock purchases were made using margin loans, meaning people were buying stocks with money they didn't actually have, borrowing up to 90% of the price. Imagine putting $10 down to buy a $100 stock, thinking you'll make a profit fast. Now imagine millions of people doing this at the same time. This dangerous trend inflated stock prices far beyond their real value. Companies weren't earning enough profit to justify their soaring stock prices. But in the 1920s, nobody cared. Newspapers celebrated the new American prosperity. Politicians claimed the economy had reached a permanent high plateau, and ordinary people believed them. Why wouldn't they? Everyone seemed to be getting rich. But beneath that wealth was a foundation made of paper. The first cracks appeared quietly. In early 1929, some economists and bankers started warning that stock prices were dangerously inflated. A few major investors began selling large amounts of stock, hoping to secure their profits before prices dropped. When wealthy investors sell, the market wobbles, but when the public notices the wobble, panic begins to spread. That's exactly what happened on October 24, 1929, a day known as Black Thursday. Stock prices began falling rapidly. Within hours, fear rippled through the market. People rushed to sell their stocks, but the more they sold, the faster prices dropped. Newspapers reported the chaos, and by the next week, specifically October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market experienced the most catastrophic crash in U.S. history. Almost $14 billion in wealth vanished in a single day. Over $30 billion disappeared within a week. To put that in perspective, more money was lost in 1 week than the entire United States government spent during World War I. But the stock market crash wasn't the Great Depression, not yet. It was merely the trigger. What came next was far more devastating. Why didn't the economy recover quickly? Here's something most people aren't taught. The government didn't intervene. Today, when the economy weakens, governments inject money, cut interest rates, support banks, and try to prevent panic. But in 1929, the U.S. government believed the economy should fix itself. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates instead of lowering them, making credit more expensive. Banks, many of which had invested their depositors' money directly in the stock market, now found themselves unable to collect the loans they had given out. When people rushed to withdraw their savings, banks simply didn't have the cash. Over 9,000 banks failed during the Great Depression, wiping out the life savings of millions of families. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank collapsed, your money was gone forever. Unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, nearly 25% of Americans were out of work. In some cities, the unemployment rate reached 50 to 80%. People lined up for hours at soup kitchens just to receive a small bowl of watery stew. Families wandered the country looking for work, often living in makeshift shacks made of scrap metal, cardboard, or tar paper. These ragged communities became known as Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, whose refusal to intervene made him deeply unpopular. Many Americans truly believed the economic crisis would end civilization as they knew it. But the impact wasn't limited to America. Because the U.S. was the world's largest economic power, the collapse spread globally like a virus. International trade fell by more than 60%. Countries like Germany, which relied heavily on American loans after World War I, experienced catastrophic financial collapse. In fact, the Great Depression played a major role in the rise of extremist political movements around the world, including the rise of Adolf Hitler, who used Germany's economic desperation to gain support. Farmers in Asia, Africa, and South America suffered as global prices for crops crashed. Entire nations faced mass hunger and political instability. The Great Depression reshaped global politics, economies, and societies in ways still visible today. Yet, perhaps the most shocking truth about the Great Depression is this: it didn't have a single cause nor a single solution. It was the result of a chain reaction of greed, mistakes, illusions, and broken systems. And understanding this chain is crucial because the same warning signs appeared again in later financial crises, including the 2008 recession, and some economists argue we might be repeating certain patterns today. That's why learning about the Great Depression isn't just about history. It's about understanding how fragile modern economies truly are and how quickly prosperity can turn into disaster when debt, speculation, and poor leadership collide. If you really want to understand the Great Depression, not just the numbers, but the soul of it, you have to step out of statistics and imagine the lives of ordinary people who woke up one morning to find everything they trusted gone. The numbers are shocking, but the human stories are what make this era unforgettable. Picture a middle-class family in 1929. The father works at a steel factory. The mother stays home to care for the children, and it seems like the future is full of promise. They own a small home, they have a few savings in the bank. Maybe they even bought a radio, which was considered high-tech at the time. In the newspapers, everyone talks about prosperity, opportunities, and America leading the world. Now imagine the father goes to work one morning and finds a sign on the factory gate: closed until further notice. No warning, no explanation, no way to pay the mortgage, no unemployment insurance, and no government support. Within weeks, the family's savings vanish when their local bank collapses. Their home is repossessed. Their belongings are sold off. Their reputation, everything they worked for, is gone. Multiply that story not by hundreds or thousands, but by millions. The Great Depression was the collapse of the American dream itself. To make things worse, the early 1930s brought another blow few people expected: the Dust Bowl. While banks were failing and factories were closing, nature delivered a devastating punch to America's agricultural heartland. Years of poor farming practices combined with severe drought turned vast areas of Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico into a desert-like wasteland. Winds lifted millions of tons of dry topsoil into the sky, creating massive black dust storms that rolled across the land like walls of smoke. These storms could block out the sun for hours and bury homes under mounds of dust. Farmers who were already struggling now watched their crops die and their livestock starve. Some families tried sealing their windows with wet cloths to keep the dust out, but it was unstoppable. It seeped into beds, food, and even lungs, causing a dangerous condition known as dust pneumonia. Many families were forced to pack everything they owned on the back of old trucks and migrate west, especially to California, in search of work. But California was overwhelmed with migrants. Jobs were scarce, and Okies, as they were called, were often treated with hostility and discrimination. This combination of economic collapse and environmental disaster created a level of suffering rarely seen in U.S. history. But the Depression was not just an American tragedy. To see the full picture, we must zoom out and look at the world. In the 1920s, countries were deeply interconnected through trade and loans. Especially after World War I, when the U.S. economy crashed, it pulled the entire globe into chaos. Germany, for example, was already under enormous pressure from war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The country relied heavily on American loans to stabilize its economy. When U.S. banks failed and demanded repayment, Germany collapsed almost overnight. Businesses shut down, unemployment skyrocketed, and political chaos intensified. Out of this desperation, extremist groups gained power, most notably the Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler. Many historians believe the Great Depression was one of the key factors that allowed Hitler to rise to power, which ultimately shaped the events leading to World War II. If the world economy had not collapsed so severely, history might have taken a very different path. In Britain, industrial output fell by nearly 30%. In France, political instability grew as governments rose and fell rapidly. In Japan, economic pressures pushed military leaders to seek expansion in Asia, contributing to global tensions. In Latin America, collapsing commodity prices devastated farmers and governments, forcing many countries to shift away from democratic rule. Meanwhile, in colonial regions across Africa and Asia, millions suffered as European powers cut spending, slashed wages, and raised taxes to protect their own economies. The Depression reshaped the political landscape of the entire planet. Back in the United States, the crisis revealed deep inequalities that had been ignored during the prosperous 1920s. While wealthy elites could endure the shock, some even bought stocks at low prices to profit. Later, working families had no safety nets. There were no social welfare systems, no food stamps, no federal job programs, and no protection for bank deposits. People lined up for blocks to receive a bowl of soup or a piece of bread from private charities. Churches, community centers, and volunteers did their best, but the scale of need was too immense. One of the most heartbreaking realities was the impact on children. Malnutrition became widespread. Teachers reported students fainting in class from hunger. Some children dropped out of school to find work, even though jobs were almost non-existent. Many traveled alone across the country, hopping on freight trains, dangerous, illegal, and desperate to find work or relieve their families of one more mouth to feed. Historians estimate that up to 250,000 teenagers became homeless migrants during the Depression, forming small groups that traveled from town to town, sleeping under bridges or in train yards. Another group deeply affected were veterans. These were men who had served in World War I and were promised a financial bonus to be paid in 1945. But in 1932, with their families starving, tens of thousands of veterans marched to Washington, D.C. demanding early payment. They built a massive camp near the Capitol called the Bonus Army. Instead of compassion, the U.S. government responded by sending the military led by future World War II generals Douglas MacArthur, Dwight Eisenhower, and George Patton to violently clear the camp. It was one of the most shocking events of the era and further damaged President Hoover's reputation. By 1932, the situation had become unbearable, and the American people demanded new leadership. They elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised bold action to save the country. FDR understood that the government could no longer stand back and hope for the economy to fix itself. He launched a series of programs known as the New Deal, which aimed to provide immediate relief, create jobs, and reform the financial system so such a crisis could never happen again. But here's the surprising part: the New Deal didn't solve the Great Depression overnight, and historians still debate how much of the recovery it produced. What it did do was restore hope, confidence, and stability, which were essential for rebuilding the country. FDR's reforms included creating the FDIC, which ensured bank deposits, establishing Social Security, building roads, bridges, dams, and schools, and regulating the stock market for the first time. Millions of unemployed Americans found work through New Deal programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. Writers, artists, musicians, and actors were also hired to document the crisis, create public art, and bring culture to struggling communities. Some of the most iconic photographs of the Great Depression came from this era. However, the true end of the Great Depression didn't come until the early 1940s, when World War II forced economies around the world to mobilize on a massive scale. Factories reopened to produce weapons, vehicles, uniforms, and supplies. Millions of people were employed again. For the first time in more than a decade, the global economy surged not because of prosperity, but because of war. This immense industrial effort finally pulled the United States and much of the world out of the Depression. The Great Depression didn't just change laws, it changed mindsets. It shattered the belief that markets could regulate themselves. It exposed how dangerous unchecked speculation and massive debt can be. And it forced governments to rethink their responsibilities to their citizens. Many of the protections we take for granted today, bank insurance, unemployment benefits, social safety nets, labor rights, were born out of the suffering of the 1930s. This chapter of history teaches one of the most powerful lessons of all. An economy is not just numbers on a chart, it is millions of human lives. When the system collapses, it is the ordinary people, the workers, the families, the children who pay the highest price. And as we move into the final part of this story, we'll uncover the long-term consequences, the hidden legacies, and the shocking modern parallels that most people never hear about. When people talk about the Great Depression, the story usually ends with World War II and the economic boom that followed. But that's only the visible part of the legacy. To truly understand the Depression's impact and why it still matters today, we need to look at what changed, what didn't change, and the dangerous patterns that keep repeating throughout history. After all, the Great Depression wasn't just a moment in time. It was a global earthquake that permanently reshaped the foundations of modern society. And as you'll soon see, some of the same cracks that led to the crisis nearly a century ago are beginning to show again today. Let's start with the psychological shift. Before 1929, most Americans believed success was guaranteed as long as you worked hard. The Roaring Twenties created a belief that wealth was limitless, that innovation would solve any problem, and that the future would always be brighter than the past. After the Great Depression, that confidence vanished. Millions of people who lived through it never trusted banks again. They hid cash in mattresses. They avoided debt. They bought only what they could afford. This change in mindset lasted for decades. Many researchers say the Depression created an entire generation of super savers, people who lived simply and cautiously long after the economy recovered. This trauma didn't just affect individuals, it influenced government policies, business practices, and even cultural values. For example, the US government adopted new roles that would have been unthinkable before the Depression. It began regulating financial markets, ensuring bank deposits, providing unemployment benefits, supporting farmers, and creating programs to help the elderly and disabled. The idea that the government should play a major role in stabilizing the economy became widely accepted. The stock market was no longer a wild, unregulated playground. Banks were no longer allowed to gamble with depositors' money. Workers gained rights, unions grew stronger, and minimum wage laws were introduced. These changes formed the backbone of what we now call the modern welfare state. But here's the twist. The more stable the system became, the more people began forgetting why those protections existed in the first place. That forgetfulness became clear in the decades after World War II. As the economy boomed in the 1950s and 60s, people grew confident again. Banks pushed for deregulation. Businesses demanded fewer restrictions. Investors started taking bigger risks. It didn't happen overnight, but little by little, many of the safeguards created after the Great Depression were weakened, rolled back, or ignored. The belief returned that markets could regulate themselves. And the lessons learned through suffering began to fade. This brings us to one of the most important truths. Financial crises keep happening because human memory is short, but greed is timeless. Just look at the 2008 global financial crisis. Although it wasn't as severe as the Great Depression, the causes were eerily similar. Once again, people were buying assets on credit they couldn't afford. This time it was houses rather than stocks. Once again, banks took massive risks with other people's money. Once again, regulators failed to act. And once again, the collapse spread worldwide. When historians studied the 2008 crisis, many concluded something shocking. Almost every mistake made in the 1920s had been repeated, simply disguised in modern clothing. But if these crises keep repeating, does that mean we are doomed to experience another Great Depression? That's the big question experts continue to debate. Some economists argue that modern governments now have tools like stimulus programs, central bank interventions, and global coordination that didn't exist in 1929. Others argue that today's financial system is even more fragile because it is more complex, interconnected, and dependent on debt than ever before. In fact, global debt today is higher than at any point in human history. Many countries owe more money than they can realistically repay. Corporations borrow trillions. Households rely on credit for daily life. And just like the 1920s, markets often behave as if prices will rise forever. Here's something most people don't know. Several of the world's major stock markets today are valued at levels that some analysts consider historically inflated, similar to the late 1920s before the crash. Housing prices in many countries have soared far beyond what average incomes can support. And technology companies, especially those in artificial intelligence, biotech, and digital platforms are valued so highly that some experts warn the world may be experiencing another speculative bubble. None of this means a crash is guaranteed. But it does mean the conditions that led to the Great Depression, overconfidence, debt, speculation, and inequality, are not relics of the past. They're more relevant than ever. Speaking of inequality, the Depression transformed the way societies view wealth distribution. In the early 20th century, a small elite controlled much of the world's resources. When the economy crashed, the gap between the rich and the poor grew wider, causing intense anger and frustration. This anger contributed to political revolutions, extremist movements, and the collapse of governments. Sound familiar? Today, wealth inequality is once again at one of the highest levels in modern history. A small group of billionaires owns a significant portion of global wealth, while millions struggle to survive. History shows that extreme inequality doesn't just create economic problems, it creates instability, conflict, and even violence. The Great Depression is a reminder of how dangerous it can be when a system benefits a few while leaving many behind. Another long-term impact of the Depression was the transformation of global politics. The crisis helped push countries toward nationalism, protectionism, and isolation. Governments raised tariffs to protect their own industries, but those tariffs only made the global economy worse by reducing trade. Today, we see similar debates, countries imposing trade barriers, restricting imports, and competing aggressively for resources. The more nations turn inward, the harder it becomes to maintain a stable global economy. But the Great Depression also sparked powerful positive changes. It inspired a new generation of thinkers, economists, sociologists, activists, and politicians to study how economies work and how to prevent future disasters. It gave rise to Keynesian economics, which argues that governments must intervene during downturns. It paved the way for social protections that reduced poverty and protected vulnerable citizens. It proved that suffering can produce innovation and reform. And it taught us one of the greatest lessons of all: an economy that works only in good times is not a stable economy. As we wrap up this story, there's a final truth you need to understand. The Great Depression was not just caused by economic mistakes, it was caused by human choices. Choices made by bankers, investors, politicians, businesses, and ordinary people who believed the good times would last forever. The Depression reminds us that progress can be undone quickly and prosperity is fragile. It shows us that history is not just a timeline, it's a mirror. And when we look into that mirror, we can see our own world reflected back at us. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Have we truly learned the lessons of the Great Depression, or are we ignoring them? Are we building an economy that protects people, or one that leaves millions vulnerable? Are we creating safety nets or gambling with the future? And most importantly, if another global crisis hit tomorrow, would we be ready? If you've watched this far, you're now among the small percentage of people who truly understand the Great Depression beyond the textbook version. And if this video opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe, share it with someone who loves history, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what surprised you the most? Do you think another depression could happen in our lifetime? Your opinion matters, and I want to hear it. Thank you for watching till the end. And remember, the past is not just behind us, it speaks to us. The only question is whether we choose to listen.